Hi guys, welcome back. I know it's kind of weird for me to stream twice in a night. That's not something I normally do, but I was itching, so we're gonna do it. This is my fourth session of reading, second book. I figured it was prime time, considering that Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events new Netflix series is exploding all over the world. And I'm very happy for that. I have been reading this series, and I have never found any books that I adored more since 1999, which might be even older than some of you of my viewers. I was 6 years old when I got The Bad Beginning, and I fell in love with it, and me and my mom read them as I was growing up. I remember being 9, 10 years old and standing outside of Barnes & Noble for half an hour before they opened the door to get the new books as they were releasing. So, I don't know where CJ is. Somebody jump into Discord and tell him he is more than welcome to be here. So anyway, we're going to start on the Reptile Room. If you guys want to catch up on past streams, that includes my reading and my game streams. In my info box, there's a picture of my face. Feel free to click it. It'll take you to my YouTube channel where I upload everything 3 days after I have live streamed it here. So without further ado, the feel of book streams are a lot more chill than game streams. I literally just sit here and read. I don't look at the chat until after the end of each chapter, so as not to break up the storytelling. So be patient with me. I will get to your comment as soon as I can. I hope you guys enjoy it. This is something I hope you guys can do while you're doing chores or homework or whatever. Just kind of something relaxing to hear in the background. And like I said, if anybody wants to jump in Discord real quick and remind them that I'm streaming and that they are welcome to join, please just let me know. All right. A Series of Unfortunate Events. Book the Second, The Reptile Room, by Lemony Snicket. For Beatrice. My love for you shall live forever. You, however, did not. Chapter 1. The stretch of road that leads out of the city, past Hazy Harbor and into the town of Tedia, is perhaps the most unpleasant in the world. It's called Lousy Lane. Lousy Lane runs through fields that are a sickly gray color, in which a handful of scraggly trees produce apples so sour that one only has to look at them to feel ill. Lousy Lane traverses the Grim River, a body of water that is 9/10 mud and that contains extremely unnerving fish, and it encircles a horseradish factory, so the entire area smells bitter and strong. I'm sorry to tell you that this story begins with the Baudelaire orphans traveling along this most displeasing road, and that from this moment on this story only gets worse. Of all the people in the world who have miserable lives, and as I'm sure you know there are quite a few, the Baudelaire youngsters take the cake, a phrase which here means that more horrible things have happened to them than just about anybody. Their misfortune began with an enormous fire that destroyed their home and killed both their loving parents, which is enough sadness to last anyone a lifetime, but in the case of these 3 children, it was only the bad beginning. After the fire, the siblings were sent to live with a distant relative named Count Olaf, a terrible and greedy man. The Baudelaire parents had left behind an enormous fortune, which would go to the children when Violet came of age, and Count Olaf was so obsessed with getting his filthy hands on the money that he hatched a devious plan that gives me nightmares to this day. He was caught just in time, but he escaped and vowed to get a hold of the Baudelaire fortune sometime in the future. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny still had nightmares about Count Olaf's shiny, shiny eyes, and about his one scraggly eyebrow, and most of all about the tattoo of an eye that he had on his ankle. It seemed like that eye was watching the Baudelaire orphans wherever they went. So I must tell you that if you have opened this book in the hope of finding out that the children lived happily ever after, you might as well shut it and read something else. Because Violet, Klaus, and Sunny, sitting in a small, cramped car and staring out the windows at Lousy Lane, were heading toward even more misery and woe. The Grim River and the horseradish factory were only the first of a sequence of tragic and unpleasant episodes that bring a frown to my face and a tear to my eye whenever I think about them. The driver of the car was Mr. Poe, a family friend who worked at the bank and always had a cough. He was in charge of overseeing the orphans' affairs, so it was he who decided that the children would be placed in the care of a distant relative in the country after all the unpleasantness with Count Olaf. "I'm sorry if you're uncomfortable," Mr. Poe said, coughing into a white handkerchief, "but this new car of mine doesn't fit too many people. We couldn't even fit any of your suitcases. In a week or so I'll drive back here and bring them to you." "Thank you," said Violet, who at 14 was the oldest of the Baudelaire children. Anyone who knew Violet well could see that her mind was not really on what Mr. Poe was saying, because her long hair was tied up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. Violet was an inventor, and when she was thinking up inventions, she liked to tie her hair up this way. It helped her think clearly about the various gears, wires, and ropes involved in most of her creations. "After living so long in the city," Mr. Poe continued, "I think you will find the countryside to be a pleasant change. Oh, here is the turn. We're almost there." "Good," Klaus said quietly. Klaus, like many people on car rides, was very bored, and he was sad not to have a book with him. Klaus loved to read, and at approximately 12 years of age, he had read more books than many people read in their whole lives. Sometimes he read well into the night, and in the morning could be found fast asleep with a book in his hand and his glasses still on. "I think you'll like Dr. Montgomery, too," Mr. Poe said. "He has traveled a great deal, so he has plenty of stories to tell. I've heard his house is filled with things he's brought from all the places he's been." "Backs!" Sunny shrieked. Sunny, the youngest of the Baudelaire orphans, often talked like this, as infants tend to do. In fact, besides biting things with her 4 very sharp teeth, speaking in fragments of his house, Sunny spent most of her time. It was often difficult to tell what she meant to say. At this moment, she probably meant something along the lines of, "I'm nervous about meeting a new relative." All 3 children were. "How exactly is Dr. Montgomery related to us?" Klaus asked. "Dr. Montgomery is, let me see, your late father's cousin's wife's brother. I think that's right. He's a scientist of some sort and receives a great deal of money from the government." As a banker, Mr. Poe was always interested in money. "What should we call him?" Klaus asked. "You should call him Dr. Montgomery," Mr. Poe replied, "unless he tells you to call him Montgomery. Both his first and last names are Montgomery, so it really doesn't make much difference." "His name is Montgomery?" Klaus said, smiling. "Yes, and I'm sure he's very sensitive about that, so don't ridicule him," Mr. Poe said, coughing again into his handkerchief. "Ridicule means tease." Klaus sighed. "I know what ridicule means," he said. He did not add that, of course, he also knew not to make fun of someone's name. Occasionally people thought that because the orphans were unfortunate that they were also dim-witted. Violet sighed too and took the ribbon out of her hair. She'd been trying to think up an adventure that would block the smell of horseradish from reaching one's nose, but she was too nervous about meeting Dr. Montgomery to focus on it. "Do you know what sort of scientist he is?" she asked. She was thinking Dr. Montgomery might have a laboratory that would be of use to her. "I'm afraid not," Mr. Poe admitted. "I've been very busy making the arrangements for you 3. I didn't have much time for chit-chat. Oh, here's the driveway. We've arrived." Mr. Poe pulled the car up to a steep gravel driveway and toward an enormous stone house. The house had a square front door made of dark wood, with several columns marking the front porch. To each side of the door were lights in the shapes of torches, which were brightly lit even though it was morning. Above the front door, the house had rows and rows of square windows, most of which were open to let in the breeze. But in front of the house was what was truly unusual: a vast, well-kept lawn, dotted with long, thin shrubs in remarkable shapes. As Mr. Poe's car came to a halt, the Baudelaires could see that the shrubs had been trimmed so as to look like snakes. Each hedge was a different kind of serpent, some long, some short, some with their tongues out and some with their mouths open, showing green, fearsome teeth. They were quite eerie, and Violet, Klaus, and Sunny were a bit hesitant about walking beside them on their way up to the house. Mr. Poe, who led the way, didn't seem to notice the hedges at all, possibly because he was busy coaching the children on how to behave. Now, Klaus, don't ask too many questions right away. Violet, what happened to the ribbon in your hair? I thought you looked very distinguished in it. And somebody please make sure that Sunny doesn't bite Dr. Montgomery. That would not be a good first impression. Mr. Poe stepped up to the door and rang a doorbell that was one of the loudest the children had ever heard. After a moment's pause, they could hear approaching footsteps, and Violet, Klaus, and Sunny all looked at one another. They had no way of knowing, of course, that very soon there would be more misfortune within their unlucky family, but they nevertheless felt uneasy. Would Dr. Montgomery be a kind person, they wondered? Would he at least be better than Count Olaf? Could he possibly be worse? The door creaked open slowly, and the Baudelaire orphans held their breath as they peered into the dark entryway. They saw a dark burgundy carpet that lay on the floor. They saw a stained glass light fixture that dangled from the ceiling. They saw a large oil painting of two snakes entwined together that hung on the wall. But where was Dr. Montgomery? "Hello?" Mr. Poe called out. "Hello? Hello, hello, hello!" A loud voice boomed out, and from behind the door stepped a short, chubby man with a round red face. "I am your Uncle Monty, and this is really perfect timing. I just finished making a coconut cream cake." That's the end of chapter 1. Let's catch up on this. You might as well shut it. Shuts the book. Hello, Eric Big 777. I hope you are doing well. Oh, I'm sorry, Salad. It may be because I was streaming earlier. Going to eat a bagel. Okay, great. Uncle Monty is awesome. Holland is here. Yay! I love my best friend. That's my best friend, y'all. If you haven't met her, but you probably have. I don't know what's going on. I don't think I got both of your whispers, Paige. Okay. And shall we continue? Chapter 2. Doesn't Sunny like coconut? Uncle Monty asked. He, Mr. Poe, and the Baudelaire orphans were all sitting around a bright green table, each with a slice of Uncle Monty's cake. Both the kitchen and the cake were still warm from baking. The cake was a magnificent thing, rich and creamy with a perfect amount of coconut. Violet, Klaus, and Uncle Monty were almost finished with their pieces, but Mr. Poe and Sunny had only taken one small bite each. To tell you the truth, Violet said, Sunny doesn't really like anything soft to eat. She prefers very hard food. That's unusual for a baby, Uncle Monty said, but not at all unusual for many snakes. The Barbary chewer, for example, is a snake that must have something in its mouth at all times, otherwise it begins to eat its own mouth. Very difficult to keep in captivity. Would Sunny perhaps like a raw carrot? That's plenty hard. A raw carrot would be perfect, Dr. Montgomery, Klaus replied. The children's new legal guardian got up and walked toward the refrigerator, but then turned around and wagged a finger at Klaus. None of that Dr. Montgomery stuff, he said. That's way too stuffy for me. Call me Uncle Monty. Why, my fellow herpetologists don't even call me Dr. Montgomery. What are herpetologists? Violet asked. What do they call you? Klaus asked. Children, children, Mr. Poe said sternly. Not so many questions. Uncle Monty smiled at the orphans. That's quite all right, he said. Questions show an inquisitive mind. The word inquisitive means, we know what it means, Klaus said, full of questions. Well, if you know what that means, Uncle Monty said, handing a large carrot to Sunny, then you should know what herpetology is. It's the study of something, Klaus said. Whenever a word has ology, it's the study of something. Snakes, Uncle Monty cried. Snakes, 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 that's what I study. I love snakes, all kinds, and I circle the globe looking for different kinds to study here in my laboratory. Isn't that interesting? That is interesting, Violet said. Very interesting, but isn't it dangerous? Not if you know the facts, Uncle Monty said. Mr. Poe, would you like a raw carrot as well? You've scarcely touched your cake. Mr. Poe turned red and coughed into his handkerchief for quite some time before replying. No, thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Uncle Monty winked at the children. If you like, you may call me Uncle Monty as well, Mr. Poe. Thank you, Uncle Monty, Mr. Poe said stiffly. Now I have a question, if you don't mind. You mentioned that you circle the globe. Is there someone who will come and take care of the children while you are out collecting specimens? We're old enough to stay by ourselves, Violet said quickly, but inside she was not so sure. Uncle Monty's line of work did sound interesting, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to stay alone with her siblings in a house full of snakes. I wouldn't hear of it, Uncle Monty said. You three must come with me. In 10 days we leave for Peru, and I want you children right there in the jungle with me. Really? Klaus said. Behind his glasses, his eyes were shining with excitement. You'd really take us to Peru with you? I will be glad to have your help, Uncle Monty said, reaching over to take a bite of Sonny's piece of cake. Gustav, my top assistant, left an unexpected letter of resignation for me just yesterday. There's a man named Stefano who I have hired to take his place, but he won't arrive for a week or so, and I am way behind on preparations for the expedition. Somebody has to make sure all the snake traps are working so I don't hurt any of our specimens. Somebody has to read up on the terrain of Peru so we can navigate through the jungle without any trouble. And somebody has to slice an enormous length of rope into small workable pieces. I'm interested in mechanics, Violet said, licking her fork, so I'd be happy to learn about the snake traps. I find guidebooks fascinating, Klaus said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, so I would love to read up on Peruvian terrain. Ijope! Sonny shrieked, taking a bite of carrot. She probably meant something along the lines of, I would be thrilled to bite an enormous length of rope into small workable pieces. Wonderful, Uncle Monty cried. I'm glad you have such enthusiasm. It will make it easier to do without Gustav. It was very strange his leaving like that. I was unlucky to lose him. Uncle Monty's face clouded over. A phrase which here means took on a slightly gloomy look as Uncle Monty thought about his bad luck. Although if Uncle Monty had known what bad luck was soon to come, he wouldn't have wasted a moment thinking about Gustav. I wish, and I'm sure you wish as well, that we could go back in time and warn him, but we can't, and that is that. Uncle Monty seemed to think that was that as well, as he shook his head and smiled, clearing his brain of troubling thoughts. Well, we better get started. No time like the present, I always say. Now why don't you show Mr. Poe to his car, and I'll show you to the reptile room. The three Baudelaire children who had been so anxious when they walked through the snake-shaped hedges the first time raced confidently through them now as they escorted Mr. Poe to his automobile. Now, children, Mr. Poe said, coughing into his handkerchief, I will be back here in about a week with your luggage, and to make sure everything is all right. I know that Dr. Montgomery might seem a bit intimidating to you, but I'm sure in time you'll get used to— He doesn't seem intimidating at all, Klaus interrupted. He seems very easy to get along with. I can't wait to see the reptile room, Violet said excitedly. Mika! Sonny said, which probably meant, Goodbye, Mr. Poe, and thank you for driving us. Well, goodbye. Remember, it is just a short drive here from the city, so please contact me or anyone else at Munctuary Money Management if you have any trouble. See you soon. He gave the orphans an awkward little wave with his handkerchief, got into his small car, and drove back down the steep gravel driveway onto Lousy Lane. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny waved back, hoping that Mr. Poe would remember to roll up the car windows to the stench of horseradish so it wouldn't be so unbearable. Bambini! Uncle Monty cried out from the front door. Come along, Bambini! The Baudelaire orphans raced back through the hedges to where their new guardian was waiting for them. Violet, Uncle Monty, Violet said. My name is Violet, my brother's is Klaus, and Sonny is our baby sister. None of us is named Bambini. Bambini is an Italian word for children, Uncle Monty explained. I had a sudden urge to speak Italian. I'm so excited to have you three here with me. You're lucky I'm not speaking gibberish. Have you never had any children of your own? Violet asked. I'm afraid not, Uncle Monty said. I always meant to find a wife and start a family, but it just kept slipping my mind. Shall I show you to the reptile room? Yes, please, Klaus said. Uncle Monty led them past the painting of snakes in the entryway into a large room with a grand staircase and very, very high ceilings. Your rooms will be up there, Uncle Monty said, gesturing up the stairs. You can each choose whatever room you like and move the furniture around to suit your taste. I understand that Mr. Poe has to bring your luggage later in that puny car of his, so please make a list of anything you might need, and we'll go into town tomorrow and buy it so you don't have to spend the next few days in the same underwear. Do we really each get our own room? Violet asked. Of course, Uncle Monty said. You don't think I'd coop you up in one room when I have this enormous house, do you? What sort of person would do that? Count Olaf did, Klaus said. Oh, that's right. Mr. Poe told me, Uncle Monty said, grimacing as if he just tasted something terrible. Count Olaf sounds like an awful person. I hope he's torn apart by wild animals someday. Wouldn't that be satisfying? Oh, well, here we are, the reptile room. Uncle Monty had reached a very tall wooden door with a large doorknob right in the middle of it. It was so high up that he had to stand on his tiptoes to open it. When it swung open on its creaky hinges, the Baudelaire orphans all gasped in astonishment and delight at the room they saw. The reptile room was made entirely out of glass, with bright, clear glass walls and a high glass ceiling that rose up to a point like the inside of a cathedral. Outside the walls was a bright green field of grasses and shrubs, which was, of course, perfectly visible through the transparent walls, so standing in the reptile room was like being inside and outside at the same time. But as remarkable as the room itself was, what was inside the reptile room was much more exciting. Reptiles, of course, were lined up in locked metal cages that sat on wooden tables in 4 neat rows all the way down the room. There were all sorts of snakes, naturally, but there were also lizards, toads, and assorted other animals that the children had never seen before, not even in pictures or at the zoo. There was a very fat toad with 2 wings coming out of its back, and a 2-headed lizard that had bright yellow stripes on its belly. There was a snake that had 3 mouths, one on top of the other, and another that seemed to have no mouth at all. There was a lizard that looked like an owl, with wide eyes that gazed at them from the log on which it was perched in its cage, and a toad that looked just like a church, complete with stained glass eyes. And there was a cage with a white cloth on top of it, so you couldn't see what was inside at all. The children walked down the aisles of cages, peering into each one in amazed silence. Some of the creatures looked friendly, and some of them looked scary, but all of them looked fascinating, and the Baudelaires took a long, careful look at each one, with Klaus holding Sunny up so that she could see. The orphans were so interested in the cages that they didn't even notice what was at the far end of the reptile room until they had walked the length of each aisle, but once they reached the far end, they gasped in astonishment and delight once more. For here, at the end of the rows and rows of cages, were rows and rows of bookshelves, and each one stuffed with books of different sizes and shapes, with a cluster of tables, chairs, and reading lamps in one corner. I'm sure you remember that the Baudelaire children's parents had an enormous collection of books, which the orphans remembered fondly and missed dreadfully, and since the terrible fire, the children were always delighted to meet someone who loved books as much as they did. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny examined the books as carefully as they had the reptile cages and realized immediately that most of the books were about snakes and other reptiles. It seemed as if every book written on reptiles, from An Introduction to Large Lizards to The Care and Feeding of the Androgynous Cobra, were lined up on the shelves. And all 3 children, Klaus especially, looked forward to reading up on the creatures in the reptile room. "This is an amazing place," Violet said finally, breaking the long silence. "Thank you," Uncle Monty said. "It's taken me a lifetime to put together." We're really allowed to come inside here?" Klaus asked. "Allowed?" Uncle Monty repeated. "Of course not. You're implored to come inside here, my boy. Starting first thing tomorrow morning, all of us must be here every day in preparation for the expedition to Peru. I will clear off some of these tables for you, Violet, to work on the traps. Klaus, I expect you to read all the books about Peru that I have and make careful notes. And Sunny can sit on the floor and bite rope. We will work all day until supper time, and after supper we'll go to the movies. Are there any objections?" Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another and grinned. Any objections? The Baudelaire orphans had been living with Count Olaf, who had made them chop wood and clean up after his drunken guests while plotting to steal their fortune. Uncle Monty had just described a delightful way to spend one's time, and the children smiled at him eagerly. Of course there would be no objections. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny gazed at the reptile room and envisioned an end to their troubles as they lived their lives under Uncle Monty's care. They were wrong, of course, about their misery being over, but for the moment, the 3 siblings were hopeful, excited, and happy. "No, no, no!" Sunny cried out in apparent answer to Uncle Monty's question. "Good, good, good," Uncle Monty said, smiling. "Now let's go figure out whose room is whose." "Uncle Monty," Klaus asked shyly, "I just have one question." "What's that?" Uncle Monty said. "What's in that cage with the cloth on top of it?" Uncle Monty looked at the cage and then at the children. His face lit up with a smile of pure joy. "That, my dears, is a new snake, which I brought over from my last journey. Gustav and myself are the only people who've seen it. Next month I will present it to the Herpetological Society as a new discovery, but in the meantime I will allow you to look at it. Gather round." The Baudelaire orphans followed Uncle Monty to the cloth-covered cage, and with a flourish — the word flourish here means a sweeping gesture often used to show off — he swooped the cloth off the cage. Inside was a large black snake, as dark as a coal mine and as thick as a sewer pipe, looking right at the orphans with shiny green eyes. With the cloth off its cage, the snake began to uncoil itself and slither around its home. "Because I discovered it," Uncle Monty said, "I got to name it." "What is it called?" Violet asked. "The Incredibly Deadly Viper," Uncle Monty replied, and at that moment something happened which I'm sure will interest you. With one flick of its tail, the snake unlatched the door of its cage and slithered out onto the table, Before Uncle Monty or any of the Bodler orphans could say anything, it opened its mouth and bit Sunny right on the chin. That's the end of chapter 2. I have missed a lot. I saw it scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. So let me do a quick... Whew. Oh, Summer, I appreciate you pausing. Goodness gracious. Okay, all right. Okay, welcome everybody who's here. Let's see who we got right now. CJ, welcome. Holland, thank you for being here. E, Heartless Room, Hugh, Tom, Paige, Salad, Trisha, and Summer, welcome to my reading stream. I hope you are having a wonderful night. To answer your question about how long I'm going to read, I don't know. I'm not going to be offended if you start streaming your own stuff while I'm still going. That's cool. Whatever. All right. Waves furiously. Okay. Was that furious or furiously like this? I don't know. Okay. We're just going to continue on. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I'm enjoying reading it because I love these books so much. Okay. Chapter 3. I am very, very sorry to leave you hanging like that, but as I was writing the tale of the Bodler orphans, I happened to look at the clock and realized I was running late for a formal dinner party given by a friend of mine, Madame de Lustro. Madame de Lustro is a good friend, an excellent detective, and a fine cook, but she flies into a rage if you arrive even 5 minutes later than her invitation states, so you understand that I had to dash off. You must have thought at the end of the previous chapter that Sunny was dead and that this was the terrible thing that happened to the Bodlers at Uncle Monty's house, but I promise you, Sunny survives this particular episode. It is Uncle Monty, unfortunately, who will be dead, but not yet. As the fangs of the incredibly deadly viper closed on Sunny's chin, Violet and Klaus watched in horror as Sunny's little eyes closed and her face grew quiet. Then, moving as suddenly as the snake, Sunny smiled brightly, opened her mouth, and bit the incredibly deadly viper right on its tiny scaled nose. The snake let go of her chin, and Violet and Klaus could see that it had barely left a mark. The two older Bodler siblings looked at Uncle Monty, and Uncle Monty looked back at them and laughed. His loud laughter bounced off the glass walls of the reptile room. "Uncle Monty, what can we do?" Klaus said in despair. "Oh, I'm sorry, my dears," Uncle Monty said, wiping his eyes with his hands. "You must be very frightened, but the incredibly deadly viper is one of the least dangerous and most friendly creatures in the animal kingdom. Sunny has nothing to worry about, and neither do you." Klaus looked at his baby sister, who was still in his arms, as she playfully gave the incredibly deadly viper a big hug around its thick body, and he realized that Uncle Monty must be telling the truth. "But then, why is it called the incredibly deadly viper?" Uncle Monty laughed again. "It's a misnomer," he said, using a word which here means a very wrong name. "Because I discovered it, I got to name it, remember? Don't tell anyone about the incredibly deadly viper because I'm going to present it at the Herpetological Society and give them a good scare before explaining that the snake is completely harmless. Lord knows they've teased me many times because of my name. 'Hello, hello, Montgomery, Montgomery,' they say. 'How are you, Montgomery, Montgomery?' But at this year's conference, I'm going to get back at them with this prank." Uncle Monty drew himself up to his full height and began talking in a silly scientific voice. "Colleagues, I'll say, I would like to introduce you a new species, the incredibly deadly viper, which I found in the southwest fort of... My God, it's escaped!" And then when all my fellow herpetologists are jumping up on chairs and tables and are shrieking in fear, I'll tell them that the snake wouldn't hurt a fly. Won't that be hysterical? Violet and Klaus looked at each other and then began laughing. half in relief that their sister was unharmed and half with amusement because they thought Uncle Monty's prank was a pretty good one. Klaus put Sunny down on the floor, and the incredibly deadly viper followed, wriggling its tail affectionately around Sunny, the way you might put your arm around someone of whom you were fond. "And are there any snakes in this room that are dangerous?" Violet asked. "Of course," Uncle Monty said. "You can't study snakes for 40 years without encountering some dangerous ones. I have a whole cabinet of venom samples from every poisonous snake known to people, so I can study the ways in which these dangerous snakes work. There's a snake in this room whose venom is so deadly that your heart would stop before you even knew he'd bitten you. There's a snake who can open her mouth so wide she could swallow all of us together in one gulp. There's a pair of snakes who have learned to drive a car so recklessly that they would run you over in the street and never even stop to apologize, but all of these snakes are in cages, with much sturdier locks, and all of them can be handled safely when one has studied them enough. I promise that if you take time to learn the facts, no harm will come to you here in the Reptile Room." There's a type of situation, which occurs all too often, and which is occurring at this point in the story of the Baudelaire orphans, called dramatic irony. Simply put, dramatic irony is when a person makes a harmless remark, and someone else who hears it knows something that makes the remark have a different, and usually unpleasant, meaning. For instance, if you were in a restaurant and said out loud, "I can't wait to eat the veal marsala I ordered," and there were people around who knew that the veal marsala was poisoned and that you would die as soon as you took a bite, your situation would be one of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is a cruel occurrence, one that is almost always upsetting, and I'm sorry to have it appear in this story, but Violet, Klaus, and Sunny have such unfortunate lives that it was only a matter of time before dramatic irony would rear its ugly head. As you and I listen to Uncle Monty tell the 3 Baudelaire orphans that no harm will ever come to them in the Reptile Room, we should be experiencing the strange feeling that accompanies the arrival of dramatic irony. This feeling is not unlike the sinking in one's stomach when one is in an elevator that suddenly goes down, or when you are snug in bed and your closet door suddenly creaks open to reveal the person who has been hiding there. For no matter how safe and happy the 3 children felt, no matter how comforting Uncle Monty's words were, you and I know that soon Uncle Monty will be dead, and the Baudelaires will be miserable once again. During the weeks that followed, however, the Baudelaires had a wonderful time in their new home. Each morning they woke up and dressed in the privacy of their very own rooms, which they had chosen and decorated to their liking. Violet had chosen a room that had an enormous window looking out onto the snake-shaped hedges on the front lawn. She thought such a view might inspire her when she was inventing things. Uncle Monty had allowed her to tack up large pieces of white paper on each wall so she could sketch out her ideas even if they came to her in the middle of the night. Klaus had chosen a room with a cozy alcove in it. The word alcove here means a very, very small nook, just perfect for sitting and reading. With Uncle Monty's permission, he had carried up a large cushioned chair from the living room and placed it right in the alcove, under a heavy brass reading lamp. Each night, rather than reading in bed, he would curl himself up in the chair with a book from Uncle Monty's library, sometimes until morning. Sunny had chosen a room right between Violet and Klaus's, and filled it with small hard objects from all over the house so she could bite them when she felt like it. There was also assorted toys for the incredibly deadly viper, so the 2 of them could play together whenever they wanted, within reason. But where the Baudelaire orphans most liked to be was the Reptile Room. Each morning after breakfast they would join Uncle Monty, who would have already started work on the upcoming expedition. Violet sat at a table with the ropes, gears, and cages that made up the different snake traps, learning how they worked, repairing them if they were broken, and occasionally making improvements to make the traps more comfortable for the snakes on their long journey from Peru to Uncle Monty's house. Klaus sat nearby, reading the books on Peru Uncle Monty had, and taking notes on a pad of paper so they could refer to them later. And Sunny sat on the floor, biting a long rope into shorter pieces with great enthusiasm. But what the Baudelaire youngsters liked best was learning about all the reptiles from Uncle Monty. As they worked, he would show them the Alaskan cow lizard, a long green creature that produced delicious milk. They met the dissonant toad, which could imitate human speech in a gravelly voice. Uncle Monty taught them how to handle the inky newt without getting its black dye all over their fingers, and how to tell when the irascible python was grumpy and best left alone. He taught them not to give the green gimlet toad too much water, and to never, under any circumstances, let the Virginian wolf snake near a typewriter. While he was telling them about the different reptiles, Uncle Monty would often segue, a word which here means to let the conversation veer off, to stories from his travels, describing the men, snakes, women, toads, children, and lizards he'd met on his journeys. And before too long, the Baudelaire orphans were telling Uncle Monty about their own lives, eventually talking about their parents and how much they missed them. Uncle Monty was as interested in the Baudelaire stories as they were in his, and sometimes they got to talking so long they scarcely had time to gobble down dinner before cramming themselves into Uncle Monty's tiny Jeep and heading to the movies. One morning, however, when the three children finished their breakfast and went into the reptile room, they found not Uncle Monty, but a note from him. The note read as follows: Dear Bambini, I have gone into town to buy a few last things we will need for the expedition. Peruvian wasp repellent, toothbrushes, canned peaches, and a fireproof canoe. It will take a while to find the peaches, so don't expect me back until dinner time. Stefano, Gustave's replacement, will arrive today by taxi. Please make him feel welcome. As you know, it is only 2 days until the expedition, so please work very hard today. Your giddy uncle, Monty. What does giddy mean? Violet asked when they had finished reading the note. Dizzy and excited? Klaus said, having learned the word from a collection of poetry he'd read in first grade. I guess he means excited about Peru, or maybe he's excited about having a new assistant. Or maybe he's excited about us, Violet said. Kindle! Sonny shrieked, which probably meant or maybe he's excited about all these things. I'm a little giddy myself, Klaus said. It's really fun to live with Uncle Monty. It certainly is, Violet agreed. After the fire, I thought we'd never be happy again, but our time here has been wonderful. I still miss our parents, though, Klaus said. No matter how nice Uncle Monty is, I wish we still lived in our home. Of course, Violet said quickly. She paused and slowly said out loud something she had been thinking about for the past few days. I think we'll always miss our parents, but I think we can miss them without being miserable all the time. After all, they wouldn't want us to be miserable. Remember that time, Klaus asked wistfully, when we were bored one rainy afternoon and all of us painted our toenails bright red? Yes, Violet said, grinning, and I spilled some on the yellow chair. Archo, Sonny said quietly, which probably meant something like, and the stain never really came out. The Baudelaire orphans smiled at each other and without a word began to do the day's work. For the rest of the morning they worked quietly and steadily, realizing that their contentment here at Uncle Monty's house did not erase their parents' death, not at all, but at least it made them feel better after feeling so sad for so long. It is unfortunate, of course, that this quiet, happy moment was the last one the children would have for quite some time, but there is nothing anyone can do about that now. Just when the Baudelairs were beginning to think about lunch, they heard a car pull up in front of the house and toot its horn. To the children, it signaled the arrival of Stefano. To us, it should signal the beginning of more misery. I expect that's the new assistant, Klaus said, looking up from the big Peruvian book of small Peruvian snakes. I hope he's as nice as Monty. Me too, Violet said, opening and shutting a toad trap to make sure it worked smoothly. It would be unpleasant to travel to Peru with someone who was boring or mean. Gurja, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, well, let's go find out what Stefano is like. The Baudelaires left the reptile room and walked out the front door to find a taxi parked next to the snake-shaped hedges. A very tall, thin man, with a long beard and no eyebrows over his eyes, was getting out of the back seat, carrying a black suitcase with a shiny silver padlock. I'm not going to give you a tip, the bearded man was saying to the driver of the taxi, because you talk too much. Not everyone wants to hear about your new baby, you know. Oh, hello there, I'm Stefano, Dr. Montgomery's new assistant. How do you do? How do you do? Violet said, and as she approached him, there was something familiar about his wheezy voice. Vaguely familiar. How do you do? Klaus said, and as he looked up at Stefano, there was something about his shiny eyes that seemed quite familiar. Huda! Sonny shrieked. Stefano wasn't wearing any socks, and Sonny, crawling on the ground, could see his bare ankle between his pant cuff and his shoe. There on his ankle was something that was the most familiar of all. The Baudelaire orphans all realized the same thing at the same time and took a step back as you might from a growling dog. This man wasn't Stefano, no matter what he called himself. The three children looked at Uncle Monty's new assistant from head to toe and saw that he was none other than Count Olaf. He may have shaved off his one long eyebrow and grown a beard over his scraggly chin, but there was no way he could hide the tattoo of an eye on his ankle. That's the end of chapter 3. Are they really that young? What do you mean? Violet's 14, Klaus is 12, and obviously Sonny's a baby. Okay. I'm going to do, I think, one more chapter for tonight. Unless you guys just really want me to keep going, but... my neck is itchy, like right here. I know it's like an awkward place for me to be like scratching all the time, but I feel like Maybe it's like my shirt or something is itching me. Anyway. Chapter 4. One of the most difficult things to think about in life is one's regrets. Something will happen to you and you will do the wrong thing, and for years afterward you will wish you had done something different. For instance, sometimes when I am walking along the seashore or visiting the grave of a friend, I will remember a day, a long time ago, when I didn't bring a flashlight with me to a place where I should have brought a flashlight, and the results were disastrous. Why didn't I bring a flashlight, I think to myself, even though it's too late to do anything about it. I should have brought a flashlight. For years after this moment, in the lives of the Baudelaire orphans, Klaus thought of the time when he and his siblings realized that Stefano was actually Count Olaf, and was filled with regret that he didn't call out to the driver of the taxicab who was beginning to drive back down the driveway. "Stop!" Klaus would think to himself, even though it was too late to do anything about it. "Stop and take this man away!" Of course, it's perfectly understandable that Klaus and his sisters were too surprised to act so quickly, but Klaus would lie awake in bed years later, thinking that maybe, just maybe, if he'd acted in time, he could have saved Uncle Monty's life. But he didn't. As the Baudelaire orphans stared at Count Olaf, the taxi drove back down the driveway and the children were alone with their nemesis, a word which here means the worst enemy you could imagine. Olaf smiled at them the way Uncle Monty's Mongolian mean snake would smile when a white mouse was placed in its cage each day for dinner. "Perhaps one of you might carry my suitcase into my room," he suggested in his wheezy voice. "The ride along that smelly road was dull and unpleasant, and I am very tired." "If anyone ever deserved to travel along Lousy Lane," Violet said, glaring at him, "it is you, Count Olaf. We will certainly not help you with your luggage, because we will not let you into this house." Olaf frowned at the orphans, and then looked this way and that as if he expected to see someone hiding behind the snake-shaped hedges. "Who is Count Olaf?" he asked quizzically. "My name is Stefano. I am here to assist Montgomery with his upcoming expedition to Peru. I assume you three are midgets who work as servants in the Montgomery home." "We're not midgets," Klaus said sternly. "We are children. And you are not Stefano, you are Count Olaf. You may have grown a beard and shaved your eyebrow, but you are still the same despicable person, and we will not let you into this house." "Futa!" Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "I agree." Count Olaf looked at each of the Baudelaire orphans, his eyes shining brightly as if he were telling a joke. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, "but if I did, and I were this Count Olaf you speak of, I would think that you were being very rude. And if I thought you were rude, I might get angry. And if I got angry, who knows what I would do." The children watched as Count Olaf raised his scrawny arms in a sort of shrug. It probably isn't necessary to remind you just how violent he could be, but it certainly wasn't necessary at all to remind the Baudelaires. Klaus could still feel the bruise on his face from the time Count Olaf had struck him when they were living in his house. Sonny still ached from being stuffed into a birdcage and dangled from the tower where he made his evil plans, and while Violet had not been the victim of any physical violence from this terrible man, she had almost been forced to marry him, and that was enough to make her pick up his suitcase and drag it slowly toward the door to the house. "Higher," Olaf said. "Lift it higher. I don't want it dragged along the ground like that." Klaus and Sonny hurried to help Violet with their suitcase, but even with the three of them carrying it, the weight made them stagger. It was misery enough that Count Olaf had reappeared in their lives just when they were feeling so comfortable and safe with Uncle Monty, but to actually be helping this awful person into their home was almost more than they could bear. Olaf followed closely behind them, and the three children could smell his stale breath as they brought the suitcase indoors and set it on the carpet beneath the painting of the entwined snakes. "Thank you, orphans," Olaf said, shutting the front door behind him. "Now Dr. Montgomery said my room should be waiting upstairs. I suppose I can carry my luggage from here. Now run along. We'll have lots of time to get to know one another later." "We already know you, Count Olaf," Violet said. "You obviously haven't changed a bit." "You haven't changed either," Olaf said. "It is clear to me, Violet, that you are as stubborn as ever. And Klaus, you are still wearing those idiotic glasses from reading too many books, and I see that little Sonny here still has 9 toes instead of 10. "Foot?" Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "I do not." "What are you talking about?" Klaus said impatiently. "She has 10 toes, just like everybody else." "Really?" Olaf said. "That's odd. I remember that she lost one of her toes in an accident." His eyes shone even brighter, as if he were telling a joke, and he reached into the pocket of his shabby coat and brought out a long knife, such as one might use for slicing bread. "I seem to recall that there was this man who was so confused by being called repeatedly by the wrong name that he accidentally dropped a knife on her little foot and severed one of her little toes." Violet and Klaus looked at Count Olaf, and then at the bare foot of their little sister. "You wouldn't dare," Klaus said. "Let's not discuss what I would or would not dare to do," Olaf said. "Let us discuss rather what I am to be called for as long as we are together in this house." "We'll call you Stefano if you insist on threatening us," Violet said, "but we won't be together in this house very long." Stefano opened his mouth to say something, but Violet was not interested in continuing the conversation. She turned on her heel and marched primly through the enormous door of the Reptile Room, followed by her siblings. If you or I had been there, we would have thought that the Baudelaire orphans weren't scared at all, speaking so bravely like that to Stefano and then simply walking away. But once the children reached the far end of the room, their true emotion showed clearly on their faces. The Baudelaires were terrified. Violet put her hands over her face and leaned against one of the reptile cages. Klaus sank into a chair, trembling so hard his feet rattled against the marble floor. And Sunny curled up into a little ball on the floor, so tiny you might have missed her if you walked into the room. For several moments none of the children spoke, just listened to the muffled sounds of Stefano walking up the stairs and their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. "How did he find us?" Klaus asked. His voice was a hoarse whisper, as if he had a sore throat. "How did he get to be Uncle Monty's assistant? What is he doing here?" "He vowed he'd get his hands on the Baudelaire fortune," Violet said, taking her hands away from her face and picking up Sunny, who was shivering. "That was the last thing he said to me before he escaped. He said he'd get our fortune if it was the last thing he ever did." Violet shuddered, and did not add that he'd also said that once he got their fortune he'd do away with all three of the Baudelaire siblings. She did not need to add it. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny all knew that if he figured out a way to seize their fortune, he would slit the throats of the Baudelaire orphans as easily as you or I might eat a small butter cookie. "What can we do?" Klaus asked. "Uncle Monty won't be back for hours." "Maybe we can call Mr. Poe," Violet said. "It's the middle of business hours, but maybe he could leave the bank for an emergency." "He wouldn't believe us," Klaus said. "Remember when we tried to tell him about Count Olaf when we lived there? He took such a long time to realize the truth it was almost too late. I think we should run away. If we leave right now, we could probably get to town in time to catch a train far away from here." Violet pictured the three of them all alone, walking along Lousy Lane beneath the sour apple trees with the bitter smell of horseradish encircling them. "Where would we go?" she asked. "Anywhere," Klaus said. "Anywhere but here. We could go far away, where Count Olaf wouldn't find us, and change our names so no one would know who we were." "We haven't any money," Violet pointed out. "How could we live by ourselves?" "We could get jobs," Klaus replied. "I could work in a library, maybe, and you could work in some sort of mechanical factory. Sunny probably couldn't get a job at her age, but in a few years she could." The three orphans were quiet. They tried to picture leaving Uncle Monty and living by themselves, trying to find jobs and take care of each other. It was a very lonely prospect. The Baudelaire children sat in sad silence a while, and they were each thinking the same thing. They wished that their parents had never been killed in this fire, and their lives had never been turned topsy-turvy the way they had. If only the Baudelaire orphans were still alive, the youngsters wouldn't even have heard of Count Olaf, let alone have him settling into their home and undoubtedly making evil plans. "We can't leave," Violet said finally. "Count Olaf found us once, and I'm sure he'd find us again, no matter how far we went. Plus, who knows where Count Olaf's assistants are? Perhaps they've surrounded the house right now, keeping watch in case we're on to him." Klaus shivered. He hadn't been thinking of Olaf's assistants. Besides scheming to get his hands on the Baudelaire fortune, Olaf was the leader of a terrible theater troupe, and his fellow actors were always ready to help him with his plans. They were a gruesome crew, each more terrifying than the next. There was a bald man with a long nose who always wore a black robe. There were two women who always had ghostly white powder on their faces, and there was a person so large and blank-looking you couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. And there was a skinny man with two hooks where his hands should have been. Yeah, Violet was right. Any of these people could be lurking outside Uncle Monty's house waiting to catch them if they tried to escape. "I think we should wait for Uncle Monty to come back and tell him what happened," Violet said. "He'll believe us. If we tell him about the tattoo, he'll at least ask Stefano for an explanation." Violet's tone of voice when she said Stefano indicated her utter scorn for Olaf's disguise. "Are you sure?" Klaus said. "After all, Uncle Monty is the one who hired Stefano." Klaus's tone of voice when he said Stefano indicated that he shared his sister's feelings. "For all we know, Uncle Monty and Stefano have planned something together." "Minda!" Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "Don't be ridiculous, Klaus." Violet shook her head. "Sunny's right. I can't believe that Uncle Monty would be in cahoots with Olaf. He's been so kind and generous to us, and besides, if they were working together, Olaf wouldn't insist on using a different name." "That's true," Klaus said thoughtfully. "So we wait for Uncle Monty?" "We wait," Violet agreed. "Tuju." Sunny said solemnly, and the siblings looked at one another glumly. Waiting is one of life's hardships. It is hard enough to wait for a chocolate cream pie while burnt roast beef is still on your plate. It's plenty difficult to wait for Halloween when the tedious month of September is still ahead of you. But to wait for one's adopted uncle to come home while a greedy and violent man is upstairs was one of the worst waits the Bodlers had ever experienced. To get their minds off it, they tried to continue with their work, but the children were too anxious to get anything done. Violet tried to fix a hinged door on one of the traps, but all she could concentrate on was the knot of worry in her stomach. Klaus tried to read about protecting oneself from thorny Peruvian plants, but thoughts of Stefano kept clouding his brain. And Sunny tried to bite rope, but she had a cold chill of fear running through her teeth, and she soon gave up. She didn't even feel like playing with the incredibly deadly viper. So the Bodlers spent the rest of the afternoon sitting silently in the reptile room, looking out the window for Uncle Monty's Jeep and listening to the occasional noise from upstairs. They didn't even want to think about what Stefano might be unpacking. Finally, as the snake-shaped hedges began to cast long, skinny shadows in the setting sun, the three children heard an approaching engine, and the Jeep pulled up. A large canoe was strapped to the roof of the Jeep, and the back seat was piled with Monty's purchases. Uncle Monty got out, struggling under the weight of several shopping bags, and saw the children through the glass walls of the reptile room. He smiled at them. They smiled back, and in that instant, when they smiled, was created another moment of regret for them. Had they not paused to smile at Monty, but instead gone dashing out to the car, they may have had a brief moment alone with him. But by the time they reached the entry hall, he was already talking to Stefano. "I didn't know what kind of toothbrush you preferred," Uncle Monty was saying apologetically, "so I got you one with extra firm bristles because that's the kind I like. Peruvian food tends to be sticky, so you need to have at least one extra toothbrush whenever you go there." "Extra firm bristles are just fine with me," Stefano said, speaking to Uncle Monty, but looking at the orphans with his shiny eyes. "Shall I carry in the canoe?" "Yes, but my goodness, you can't carry it all by yourself," Uncle Monty said. "Klaus, please help Stefano, will you?" "Uncle Monty," Violet said, "we have something very important to tell you." "I'm all ears," Uncle Monty said, "but first let me show you the wasp repellent I picked up. I am so glad Klaus read up on the insect situation in Peru, because the other repellents I have would have been no use at all." Uncle Monty rooted through one of the bags on his arm as the children waited impatiently for him to finish. "This one contains a chemical called—" "Uncle Monty," Klaus said, "what we have to tell you really can't wait." "Klaus," Uncle Monty said, his eyebrows rising in surprise, "it's not polite to interrupt when your uncle is talking. Now please help Stefano with the canoe, and we will talk about anything you want in a few moments." Klaus sighed, but followed Stefano out the open door. Violet watched them walking toward the Jeep as Uncle Monty put down the shopping bags and faced her. "I can't remember what I was saying about the repellent," he said a little crossly. "I hate losing my train of thought." "Well, we have to tell you," Violet began, but she stopped when something caught her eye. Monty was facing away from the door, so he couldn't see what Stefano was doing, but Violet saw Stefano stop at the snake-shaped hedges, reach into his coat pocket, and take out the long knife. Its blade caught the light of the setting sun, and it glowed brightly like a lighthouse. As you probably know, lighthouses serve as warning signals, telling ships where the shore is so they don't run into it. The shining knife was a warning, too. Klaus looked up at the knife, and then at Stefano, and then at Violet. Violet looked at Klaus, and then at Stefano, and then at Monty. Sunny looked at everyone. Only Monty didn't notice what was going on, so intent was he on remembering whatever he was babbling about wasp repellent. "What we have to tell you," Violet began again, but she couldn't continue. Stefano didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Violet knew that if she breathed one word about his true identity, Stefano would hurt her brother right there at the snake-shaped hedges. Without saying a word, the nemesis of the Bodler orphans had sent a very clear warning. Let's catch up. Oh no, Paige! Having troubles. Okay, so that's 4 chapters finished. So we are just shy of a third through the book. since there's 13 chapters in every book. I don't know if you guys want me to keep going or if you think this is a good stopping point. I won't be offended if you guys are cool with this being the end, but it is 10:22, so I don't know. Anyway, kind of just let me know what you guys would like. I hope you guys are enjoying it. I hope this isn't like crazy boring or anything for you. Sorry, Paige. Sorry you're having internet trouble. First person who tells me whether to keep going or stop is going to be the winner, so tried to get my background to match the book color, which obviously looks a little bit of blue because it's reflecting off my computer, but as you can see, I have the book cover there. Keep going? Okay, I'll keep going. Alright, for Tumi Timo. Chapter 5. That night felt like the longest and most terrible the Bowler orphans had ever had, and they'd had plenty. There was one night shortly after Sunny was born that all 3 children had a horrible flu and tossed and turned in the grasp of a terrible fever, while their father tried to soothe them all at once, placing cold washcloths on their sweaty brows. This night, after their parents had been killed, the 3 children had stayed up at Mr. Poe's house all night, too miserable and confused to even try to sleep, and of course they had spent many a long and terrible night while living with Count Olaf. But this particular night seemed worse. From the moment of Monty's arrival until bedtime, Stefano kept the children under his constant surveillance, a phrase which here means kept watching them so they couldn't possibly talk to Uncle Monty alone and reveal that he was really Count Olaf, and Uncle Monty was too preoccupied to think that anything unusual was going on. When they brought in the rest of Uncle Monty's purchases, Stefano carried bags with only one hand, keeping the other one in his coat pocket where the long knife was hidden, but Uncle Monty was too excited about all the new supplies to talk about it. When they went into the kitchen to prepare dinner, Stefano smiled menacingly at the children as he sliced mushrooms, but Uncle Monty was too busy making sure the stroganoff sauce didn't boil to even notice that Stefano was using his own threatening knife for the chopping. Over dinner, Stefano told funny stories and praised Monty's scientific work, and Uncle Monty was so flattered he didn't think to guess that Stefano was holding a knife under the table, rubbing the blade gently against Violet's knee for the entire meal. And when Uncle Monty announced that he would spend the evening showing his new assistant around the Reptile Room, he was too eager to realize that the Bowdlers simply went up to bed without a word. For the first time, having individual bedrooms seemed like a hardship rather than a luxury, for without one another's company, the orphans felt even more lonely and helpless. Violet stared at the paper tacked to her wall and tried to imagine what Stefano was planning. Klaus sat in his large cushioned chair and turned on his brass reading lamp, but was too worried to even open a book. Sunny stared at her hard objects, but didn't bite a single one of them. All 3 children thought of walking down the hall to Uncle Monty's room and waking him up to tell him what was wrong, but to get to his bedroom, they would have to walk past the room in which Stefano was staying, and all night long Stefano kept watch in a chair placed in front of his open door. When the orphans opened their doors to peer down the dark hallway, they saw Stefano's pale, shaved head, which seemed to be floating above his body in the darkness. And they could see his knife, which Stefano was moving slowly like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. Back and forth it went, back and forth, glinting in the dim light, and the sight was so fearsome they didn't dare try walking down the hallway. Finally, the light in the house turned the pale blue-gray of early dawn, and the Bowdler children walked blearily down the stairs to breakfast, tired and achy from their sleepless night. They sat around the table where they had eaten cake on their first morning at the house and picked listlessly at their food. For the first time since their arrival at Uncle Monty's, they were not eager to enter the Reptile Room and begin the day's work. "I suppose we have to go in now," Violet said finally, putting aside her scarcely nibbled toast. "I'm sure Uncle Monty has already started working and is expecting us. And I'm sure that Stefano is there too," Klaus said, staring glumly into his cereal bowl. "We'll never get a chance to tell Uncle Monty what we know about him." "Yinga," Sunny said sadly, dropping her untouched raw carrot to the floor. If only Uncle Monty knew what we know, Violet said. And Stefano knew that he knew what we know, but Uncle Monty doesn't know what we know, and Stefano knows that he doesn't know what we know. I know, Klaus said. I know you know, Violet said. But what we don't know is what Count Stefano, is really up to. He's after our fortune. Certainly, but how can he get it if we're under Uncle Monty's care? Maybe he is just going to wait until you're of age and steal the fortune, Klaus said. 4 years is a long time to wait, Violet said. The 3 orphans were quiet, as each remembered where they had been 4 years ago. Violet had been 10 and had worn her hair very short. She remembered that sometime around her 10th birthday she had invented a new kind of pencil sharpener. Klaus had been about 8, and he remembered how interested he'd been in comets, reading all the astronomy books his parents had in their library. Sunny, of course, had not been born 4 years ago, and she sat and tried to remember what that was like. Very dark, she thought, with nothing to bite. For all 3 youngsters, 4 years did seem like a very long time. Come on, you are moving very slowly this morning, Uncle Monty said, bursting into the room. His face seemed even brighter than usual, and he was holding a small bunch of folded papers in one hand. Stefano has only worked here 1 day, and he's already in the Reptile Room. In fact, he was up before I was. I ran into him on my way down the stairs. He's an eager beaver. But you 3, you're moving like the Hungarian sloth snake, whose top speed is ½ an inch per hour. We have lots to do today, and I'd like to catch up on the 6 o'clock. And I'd like to catch the 6 o'clock showing of Zombies in the Snow tonight, so let's try to hurry. Violet looked at Uncle Monty and realized that this might be their only opportunity to talk to him alone, without Stefano around, but he seemed so wound up that they weren't sure if he would listen to them. Speaking of Stefano, she said timidly, we'd like to talk to you about him. Uncle Monty's eyes widened, and he looked around him as if there were spies in the room before leaning in to whisper to the children. I'd like to talk to you too, he said. I have my suspicions about Stefano, and I'd like to discuss them with you. The Bodler orphans looked at one another in relief. You do? Klaus said. Of course, Uncle Monty said. Last night, I began to get very suspicious about this new assistant of mine. There's something a little spooky about him, and Uncle Monty looked around again and began speaking even softer, so the children had to hold their breaths to hear him. And I think we should discuss it outside, shall we? The children nodded in agreement and rose from the table, leaving their dirty breakfast dishes behind, which is not a good thing to do in general, but perfectly acceptable in the face of an emergency. They walked with Uncle Monty to the front entryway, past the painting of 2 snakes entwined together, out the front door and onto the lawn, as if they wanted to talk to the snake-shaped hedges instead of one to another. I don't mean to be vainglorious, Uncle Monty said, using a word which here means braggy, but I really am one of the most widely respected herpetologists in the world. Klaus blinked. It was an unexpected beginning for the conversation. Of course you are, he said, but... And because of this, I'm sad to say, Uncle Monty continued as if he had not heard, many people are jealous of me. I'm sure that's true, Violet said, puzzled. And when people are jealous, Uncle Monty said, shaking his head, they will do anything. They will do crazy things. When I was getting my herpetology degree, my roommate was so envious of a new toad I had discovered that he stole and ate my only specimen. I had to x-ray his stomach and use the x-rays rather than the toad in my presentation. And something tells me we may have a similar situation here. What was Uncle Monty talking about? I'm afraid I don't quite follow you, Klaus said, which was the polite way of saying, What are you talking about, Uncle Monty? Last night, after you went to bed, Stefano asked me a few too many questions about the snakes and my upcoming expedition. Do you know why? I think so, Violet began, but Uncle Monty interrupted her. It is because this man, who is calling himself Stefano, he said, is really a member of the Herpetological Society, and he is here to try and find the incredibly deadly viper so he can preempt my presentation. Do you 3 know what the word preempt means? No, Violet said, but it means that I think this Stefano is going to steal my snake, Uncle Monty said, and present it to the Herpetological Society. Because it's a new species, there's no way I can prove I discovered it. Before we know it, the incredibly deadly viper will be called the Stefano snake or something dreadful like that, and if he's planning that, just think of what he will do to our Peruvian expedition. Each toad we catch, each venom sample we put in a test tube, every snake interview that we record, every scrap of work we do will fall into the hands of this Herpetological Society spy. He's not a Herpetological Society spy, Klaus said impatiently. He's Count Olaf! I know just what you mean, Uncle Monty said excitedly. This sort of behavior is indeed as dastardly as that terrible man's. That is why I'm doing this. He raised one hand and waved the folded papers in the air. As you know, he said, tomorrow we are leaving for Peru. These are our tickets for the 5 o'clock voyage on the Prospero, a fine ship that will take us across the sea to South America. There's a ticket for me, one for Violet, one for Klaus, one for Sonny, one for Stefano. Let me start that sentence over. There's a ticket for me, one for Violet, one for Klaus, one for Stefano, but not one for Sonny because we're going to hide her in a suitcase to save money. Depot! I'm kidding about that, but I'm not kidding about this. Uncle Monty, his face flushed with excitement, took one of the folded papers and began ripping it into tiny pieces. This is Stefano's ticket. He's not going to Peru with me after all. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to tell him that he needs to stay here and look after my specimens instead. That way we can run a successful expedition in peace. But Uncle Monty, Klaus said, how many times must I remind you it's not polite to interrupt? Uncle Monty interrupted, shaking his head. In any case, I know what you're worried about. You're worried about what will happen if he stays here alone with the incredibly deadly Viper. But don't worry, the Viper will join us on the expedition, traveling in one of our snake-carrying cases. I don't know why you're looking so glum, Sonny. I thought you'd be happy to have a Viper's company. So don't look so worried, Bambini. As you can see, your Uncle Monty has this situation in hand. When somebody is a little bit wrong, say when a waiter puts non-fat milk in your espresso macchiato instead of low-fat milk, it is often quite easy to explain to them how and why they are wrong. But if someone is surpassingly wrong, say when a waiter bites your nose instead of taking your order, you can often be so surprised that you are unable to say anything at all. Paralyzed by how wrong the waiter is, your mouth would hang slightly open and your eyes would blink over and over, but you would be unable to say a word. This is what the Baudelaire children did. Uncle Monty was so wrong about Stefano in thinking he was a herpetological spy instead of Count Olaf that the three children could scarcely think of a way to tell him so. Come now, my dears, Uncle Monty said. We've wasted enough of the morning on talk. We have to— Ow! He interrupted himself with a cry of surprise and pain and fell to the ground. Uncle Monty? Klaus cried. The Baudelaire children saw that a large shiny object was on top of him and realized a moment later what the object was. It was the heavy brass reading lamp, the one standing next to the large cushioned chair in Klaus's room. Ow! Uncle Monty said again, pulling the lamp off him. That really hurt. My shoulder may be sprained. It's a good thing it didn't land on my head, or it really could have done some damage. But where did it come from? Violet asked. It must have fallen from the window, Uncle Monty said, pointing up to where Klaus's room was. Whose room is that? Klaus, I believe it's yours. You must be more careful. You can't dangle heavy objects out the window like that. Look what almost happened. But that lamp wasn't anywhere near my window, Klaus said. I keep it in the alcove so I can read in that large chair. Really, Klaus, Uncle Monty said, standing up and handing him the lamp. Do you honestly expect me to believe that the lamp danced over to the window and leapt onto my shoulder? Please put it back in your room, in a safe place, and we'll say no more about it. But, Klaus said, but his older sister interrupted him. I'll help you, Klaus, Violet said. We'll find a place where it's safe. Well, don't be too long, Uncle Monty said, rubbing his shoulder. We'll see you in the reptile room. Come, Sonny. Walking through the entry hall, the four parted ways at the stairs, with Uncle Monty and Sonny going to the enormous door of the reptile room, and Violet and Klaus carrying the heavy brass lamp up to Klaus's room. You know very well, Klaus hissed to his sister, that I was not careless with this lamp. Of course I know that, Violet whispered, but there's no use trying to explain that to Uncle Monty. He thinks Stefano is a herpetological spy. You know as well as I do that Stefano was responsible for this. How clever of you to figure that out, said a voice at the top of the stairs, and Violet and Klaus were so surprised they almost dropped the lamp. It was Stefano, or if you prefer, it was Count Olaf. It was the bad guy. But then, you've always been clever children, he continued. A little too clever for my taste, but you won't be around for long, so I'm not troubled by it. You're not very clever yourself, Klaus said fiercely. This heavy brass lamp almost hit us, but if anything happens to my sisters or me, you'll never get your hands on the Baudelaire fortune. Dear me, Stefano said, his grimy teeth showing as he smiled. If I wanted to harm you, orphan, your blood would already be pouring down these stairs like a waterfall. No, I'm not going to harm a hair on any Baudelaire head. Not here in this house. You needn't be afraid of me, little ones, until we find ourselves in a location where crimes are more difficult to trace. And where would that be? Violet asked. We plan to stay right here until we grow up. Really? Stefano said in that sneaky, sneaky voice. Why, I had the impression we were leaving the country tomorrow. Uncle Monty tore up your ticket, Klaus replied triumphantly. He was suspicious of you, so he changed his plans, and now you're not going with us. Stefano's smile turned into a scowl, and his stained teeth seemed to grow bigger. His eyes grew so shiny that it hurt Violet and Klaus to look at them. I wouldn't rely on that, he said in a terrible, terrible voice. Even the best plans can change if there's an accident. He pointed one spiky finger at the brass reading lamp. And accidents happen all the time. Okay, that's the end of chapter 5. We're almost halfway through. Let me catch up on this real quick. Okay, guys, it's 10:38. I'm getting kind of tired. This has kind of helped me relax into kind of a chill stream. So I think I'm going to call it here for the day. Thank you guys so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back soon with some more reading. I'll also be picking up Nancy Drew again soon as well with Captive Curse. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the night. Take care of yourselves. Much love to everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.